Welcome to What Do Siblings Talk About?
I'm Jacob,
And I'm Veronica.
and we're siblings.
Yay.
And welcome back to our special bonus episode in honor of a very special occasion. We just came off of episode 7. So this is going to be in the same theme. We were just in episode 7 talking about exorcisms and the Catholic Church, demons, this sort of thing, and we're rolling right off of that into the election of a new Catholic Pope. So we've had Pope Francis for about a dozen years, and there's now a new Pope, Pope Leo, who is American. So today is a cage match, Leo versus Francis, and we're going to see which one comes out on top. Are you on board for this exciting venture, Veronica?
I mean, one of them is alive, so I feel like he's just by default he's going to win.
Yeah, so we were initially envisioning an episode on the legacy of Pope Francis, and it brought to mind the Shakespeare play Julius Caesar, where there's the famous line, I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. And I was thinking we would do sort of the opposite, like I come to praise Francis, not to bury him. But, we've got an American now, so maybe it is okay to...
We can't not do that.
We can bury Francis at this point. But not joking. We were going to use this moment of reflecting on the life of Pope Francis. I feel like I have some very mixed thoughts on Pope Francis. I don't think I would call myself either a Francis hater or a Francis lover. There were some things I liked very much and some things that confused me, and I wanted to talk about that. And then Pope Leo, obviously we know much less about him, but we can talk about... Yeah, we can talk about some of what we know, and we can speculate. Veronica, do you fall in a Francis camp?
Probably similar to you. He don't impress me much, is I guess what I would say. To quote a famous poet. I mean, there are definitely some things that he improved, but I think there was also a lot of bad that he did, and we can get into more details, but I think maybe the worst part of his papacy was not really satisfying anybody, right? I think he tried to walk a line and bring all Catholics together, but in the process managed to drive Catholics further apart.
Interesting. So I think I get where you're coming from, although I think I might say I wonder if Francis, from his perspective, was trying to shake things up. I don't even wonder this. I know he said he wanted to cause a mess, basically, but I don't think he wanted to cause a mess for the sake of causing a mess. I think he wanted to cause a mess because he felt like the status quo was not working, and he wasn't really sure where to go, but he said, something needs to be shaken up. This is
like throwing stuff against the wall, and and to be fair, I think he was completely right. I think there were a lot of things about the status quo that needed to be changed. I just sort of disagree with his method of how he went about trying to do that.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to bring up first, it was one of the first things that kind of got Pope Francis on the map was there was this sort of debate, which you could sort of cut right across the center of Catholic politics as to which side of this debate you took, where traditionally the Pope lives in this grand place called the Apostolic Palace. Right. And basically it's just the Pope and the Pope's flunkies. So that was the first thing, is the Pope said, I'm a cardinal here in Rome. I've been in Rome a lot. Whenever I come to Rome, I stay in the Vatican guest house, which is the Casa Santa Marta. All the cardinals who come to Rome and vote in the conclave, they all stay in the Casa Santa Marta. It's comfortable, it's familiar. I'm just going to stay here. And that was viewed alternatively by the more conservative and traditional folk. It was, oh my goodness, look at this Pope who doesn't respect tradition. And it's actually going to be more difficult for the Vatican to keep the Pope like safe.
Yeah.
And then you had all the liberals saying, look at this act of selflessness. He's not going to live in a palace. He's just going to stay in the guest house.
Yeah. Well, and I think actually even before that, if you want to get into like the nitty gritty of what Catholics look at when the Pope first comes out, Pope Francis.
The Pope comes out every year like a new video game. This year's Pope's coming out on May 8th.
New Pope about to drop. Everyone watch. No, and this is actually something that Leo's already impressed me favorably, because Francis didn't wear the little, I think it's a zucchetta, the little like elbow length red cape that popes get to wear. And I don't think he wore red shoes either, which again, something only popes can wear because they're cool and special. But no, it's a sign of something. Francis was very decided in, he wanted to embrace humility. And like you're saying, I think a very similar thing with the apartment and the palace. It rubbed some people the wrong way because it was seen as he was throwing aside tradition, and then other people were just ecstatic about it because they're like, look at this humble holy man who doesn't want any of all the gold and the jewels and whatever else the papacy has to offer him.
So I wanted to bring this up as sort of a typical example of the kinds of things Pope Francis did in his papacy, but then I wanted to throw a little bit of a curveball on it, because I think like much of what Francis did in his papacy, there was a deeper story. There were actually other things going on that were more nuanced. So the one is, it did take a significant part of the Casa Santa Marta out of commission. Like, that is, the Vatican is not actually particularly well off at the moment, and they don't have abundant places to keep guests. And the Casa Santa Marta is traditionally where they keep their churchy guests. And taking a significant part of the building out of commission, like they had to take an entire floor out, they had to install a lot of security apparatuses, and change a lot of things. It
would be a little bit like if the next president is elected and goes, well, you know what, I want to stay at the Naval Observatory with the vice president instead of the White House. Like, yeah, that could be seen as a sign of great humility, and he wants to live among the people and whatnot. But also, it makes things drastically harder for the Marine Corps and the Secret Service and everyone else, because everything is set up for him to be in the White House. Yep. And it's exactly the same with the Pope. Everything is set up for stuff to run a certain way, and it's been set up, some things, for 2,000 years. And so when a Pope comes in and tries to do things a different way, no matter how good his intentions are, it's going to cause problems.
Yeah. And another thing I would say that makes Pope Francis look a little bit worse is the fact that, Veronica, have you visited any castles in, say, Europe?
Not recently.
Okay.
But long time ago.
They're not the height of luxury. They are cold, drafty, small windows. Typically, they don't have elevators. You know, Pope Francis is coming in as like a 76-year-old guy. From what I know, it's probably more comfortable and convenient to live in the guest house than in the Apostolic Palace. So that makes maybe Francis look bad. On the other hand, Pope Benedict XVI came before Francis. He retired very, very unexpectedly in 2013, if I have my timing right.
Right, yeah.
And there was speculation at the time, maybe he has a terminal illness or there's something going on that he can't stay in office. And then he proceeded to live another roughly 10 years. I really think part of what, and honestly, Pope John Paul, who came before Benedict, was held at fault at times for this as well. I think Benedict and John Paul found themselves unable to run the administration of the Holy See effectively at times. And I think Pope Benedict was feeling like it was a freight train running out of control that he could not get his hands on.
Yeah.
So Pope Francis coming in, a man who had been involved in pretty serious administration and probably pretty competently as a Jesuit and an archbishop in Argentina. A part of me sympathizes with him saying, I'm not going to live at the apostolic palace where I'm sort of removed from things, and also it's very easy for certain people in the Vatican to get a hold of me and sort of corner me. I'm going to live where it's easy for me to get stuff done on my own and sort of rule on my own by fiat, because that's the only way we're going to break this damaged machine. Is I need to take control, and I need to put myself in a place where that's possible, and I can't deal with the bureaucratic nonsense.
Yeah.
So
and that's something that people, again, both praised and criticized him for, because he would do various things with sort of very little oversight from the rest of the Vatican machine, if you will. And people would get very annoyed by that, and sometimes rightly annoyed, because he would do sort of things that I think didn't have a ton of forethought. But like you're saying, it sometimes I think it was really needed to cut through some of the red tape that has built up over hundreds and thousands of years.
Yeah. So that's me feeling like I have some sympathy for Pope Francis at the same time as it was clearly a move designed in part for show, and just a whole thing.
Like a show of poverty rather than genuine poverty.
Yeah, I think so, actually.
Yeah. I got that sense occasionally, and there was I think probably everyone you talk to will have a slightly different opinion about this, but whether or not, leaving aside whether or not he was genuinely 100% trying to be humble, I personally think there's a real problem with the Pope sort of throwing off too many of his I don't know what you call them, the perks of the papal office, if you will. In the same way that Catholics often get criticized for using precious metals, gold and whatnot, for tabernacles and chalices, because people are like, Lee, you have all this fancy, expensive stuff, you should spend that on the poor. And while in a certain sense that's true, in another sense you say, well, no, this is our best stuff, and so that's what we're using for God. And the Pope, by extension, I think the office of the Pope is the same way. Yes, you can do certain things to be humble. You could wear a hair shirt underneath all your fancy vestments, but you have to be really careful about sort of throwing off too many of the papal adornments, because it's actually incorrect to be kind of too outwardly humble in that office, if that makes sense.
So two reflections I have on that right off the bat are, first of all, in the 1970s, as the Catholics were changing their liturgies, a lot of the changes involved stripping down the fineries. So less smoke and incense, fewer bells, less gold, less emphasis on everything being the most beautiful and ornate possible. And the first thing that happened when you look at the Catholic demographics during those decades, the 70s and 80s, is the first people the Catholic Church lost in the Western world were the poor. The poor stopped going to church in Catholic churches. And traditionally, those were that, comparing Catholics and Protestants, the Catholics actually had the poor, generally. But a lot of what was going on is the people implementing reforms in the 70s and 80s in the Catholic Church, they were all very smart, very well-educated people who lived in their heads all the time. So the reforms they implemented they were sort of
like highly
idealizing.
And sort of,
and they were reforms that worked for people who lived in their heads, and they could walk into a white box with like very abstract art and have an encounter with God there. And that didn't work for other people so much. So this is to your point about not abandoning the tradition just because you think it doesn't necessarily make sense for somebody like you. That maybe there's more wisdom there than you know. So that's the one thing that came to mind from what you were saying. The other is, a few years ago I was at a friend's wedding, and I didn't know them super well. I knew the family well. But I went to the wedding. I dressed in my nicest suit, put on my nicest tie, walked in. Everybody was dressed splendidly. It was a really nice wedding. And during the wedding, I just had this realization wow, events like this are an opportunity for everybody here to come together looking their best, kind of acting their best, and seeing everybody else around them in that same disposition and presentation. And that there's a real value to having these communal events where everybody is at their finest and kind of most excellent.
Yeah.
I hadn't really noticed before.
There's I think there's something to be said for people used to talk about your Sunday best, or like your Sunday suit, which has kind of fallen by the wayside now. And I mean, there's certainly some positives to that, but there's also something to be said for sort of the pomp and circumstance of things. It's actually something that I think the UK does very, very well. Is sort of pomp and circumstance and high office. And maybe in the US we do that a little bit less well, but the Vatican tends to do it very well. Lots of fancy stuff, as long as the Pope agrees to wear it.
Yeah, I meet God in nature with my 30-06. You know how it be. So, for a little context for those listening, I will drop some links. I know I'm not always perfect about adding links in the notes, but I'm going to drop some links about some context that Veronica and I used to prepare for this. One is a news article and podcast from the United Kingdom Spectator magazine, from its, I think he's the religion editor, Damien Thompson, who I find Damien very amusing because he's the Francis Scrooge. Like,
he does not pull his punches. He's very upset.
He's not just a Francis critic. Like, he's in a particularly Pope Francis just bothered Damien Thompson very much.
Him wrong, I think, just on every level.
So anyway, I just had to read Damien Thompson's little piece on the passing of Pope Francis. He's fairly nice. And then The Pillar is an American publication, sort of news outlet, primarily run by two canon lawyers. So canon lawyers are they're lawyers for church law. So unlike most Protestant denominations, the Catholic Church has its own series of laws and rules and series of courts and so forth. And effectively, it has a Supreme Court of one person, and that's the Pope. So this is actually one of the reasons the Pope is so important in the Catholic Church, is not just this idea that whatever the Pope says, everybody has to follow. That's wrong. Or whatever the Pope says, every Catholic has to believe is true. That's almost never the case. It is the fact that when the Pope says this rule all Catholics have to follow, that oftentimes is the case, and he can pretty much arbitrarily change stuff. So that's a digression.
Very, but very rare, though. People have this image of, the Pope constantly handing out rules and everyone has to behave. It's very rare that the Pope definitively says everyone has to believe this.
Well, yeah. The belief stuff is rare, but the rule stuff is fairly common.
Okay. Well, yeah.
One of the rule changes that happened in the Catholic Church in the 1970s was to let people who are not priests give out communion. And when that rule was made in the 70s by Pope Paul VI, it was only men. But in emergencies, it could be a man or a woman. So anybody who's been to a Catholic church, you've probably seen both men and women giving out communion. Well, technically, that's because every Mass was being considered an emergency. It was actually against the law for women to give out communion. Until a few years ago, when Pope Francis said, look, everybody's giving out communion anyway. Why are we breaking the law all the time? From now on, it's okay for men and women to give out communion. So that's an example of a legal change Pope Francis made. Didn't change anything. It actually just brought the law in line with what people were actually doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It isn't necessarily what you should do. It's a bit like everybody on my road routinely drove 70 miles an hour when the speed limit was 55. And the police could have just changed it to, 65, 70. They didn't. They actually dropped it to 45, and now people get speeding tickets all the time. but it's not. I mean, sometimes it is important to bring the laws uh, into whatever the
Yeah,
common custom
and
is, but other times it is incorrect.
I agree. You either want to enforce the laws that are there or adjust the law so that it's not constantly being broken. I think the example in the United States where this would be a sort of classic example in civil law is that no one on the New Jersey Turnpike drives the speed limit. Everyone's always driving far in excess of the speed limit when it's not a traffic jam. So the New Jersey police basically have carte blanche to pull anyone over at any time. So is that what you prefer? Do you prefer a system where your laws are so stringent and extreme that everybody breaks them all the time, and then it just becomes a matter of who do the authorities decide they want to pick on today? Because I don't think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
So, just a thought. We're going kind of far afield, which is kind of
You've been victimized by the New Jersey Turnpike. We'll leave a number for you to call.
Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to bring up between Leo and Francis is there were some people predicting the new pope. They were saying, oh, we've had a pope who came from a religious order. So Pope Francis came out of the Jesuits and Pope Leo came out of the Augustinians. There were some people saying, oh, maybe the cardinals who elect the pope will decide, oh, we don't want another pope from a religious order because he promoted a lot of Jesuits, and we'll just get another guy who's going to promote a lot of his buddies from his religious order. Did you hear any of that? Are you
I heard
into that?
some of that, and I think part of the problem, particularly if you're looking at news from a sort of U.S. perspective, is we're very used to this political thing where we go right, we go left, we go right, we go left, and we basically the parties just alternate taking control of things. And so I think a lot of American commentators, whether consciously or not, sort of put that lens onto the papacy, and they're like, okay, well, this time, last time we had, or actually we could even go back to Benedict. Benedict was like this, and then Francis was like this, so now they're going to go back like this with Leo. And that's not necessarily how the Vatican or the cardinals think. I mean, in certain senses, yes, it is political, but it is not. It's not like electing a president.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I would say the politics in the Catholic Church, there are politics. But when you're trying to divide groups in the Catholic Church by fault lines, there are numerous different ways you can divide by those fault lines.
Yeah.
And
it's not like a straight two-party system of here's all the left-wing cardinals and here's all the right-wing ones. It's like a 20-party system or something.
Well, but it's almost like you have multiple overlaid systems.
Yeah.
And you sort of have to.
It's like a Venn diagram of cardinals. You
know what it is, Veronica? It's intersectionality. The Catholic Church came up with it first.
There we go.
But I actually heard Cardinal Provost referred to as sort of the black box pope, in terms of he had not come across people's screens as like a particularly strong political actor in almost any respect. Not that he was sort of a blank slate, but that he didn't seem to be like standing up and coming up to bat.
Anyone. Yeah. Yeah, which may be a good thing that he's not sort of in bed with other factions necessarily. Yeah, I heard similar things about him. I mean, most of this after he was pope, because no one right. really expected him to be elected. And most of what we've heard about him and the speculating has happened after he's now pope, which is a little bit backwards.
Yeah.
But,
although I will say there's an interesting wrinkle if you want to get into the intrigue behind the election, is that
J.D. Vance, are we going there?
No, this is Cardinal Maradiaga. Have you heard of this chap?
Don't think so.
So, forgive me, I don't know which Latin American country Cardinal Maradiaga comes from, but he was considered to be influential behind the election of Pope Francis, and in the early years of Pope Francis, he was considered the guy to go to know what Pope Francis was thinking and what direction Pope Francis was likely to go in. Well, a few days before the conclave started, it became known Maradiaga had been trying to encourage the bishops, especially the Latin American bishops, to back Prevost. And Maradiaga had gotten frustrated, and he called them all traitors and flew back to South America, which is so self-defeating because I think he's under 80 and could have voted himself. And then here the conclave votes for his guy anyway.
I mean, certainly something I could imagine happening. The one thing, Pope Leo, I think I forget like what the title of his previous office was, but he basically like ran
Congregation for Bishops.
Yes, so
Dicastery.
He met with a bunch of these guys, bishops and now cardinals. So he was like a very familiar face, not necessarily the most high-powered role, but one where people were constantly coming across him and kind of knew who he was. And
even more than that, it was technically his job to decide who new bishops were. So when a position came open,
he was the guy who was sort of looking around and making recommendations. And it seems like Francis went along with a lot of his recommendations. Like they seem to work fairly well together. I mean, Francis put him in that spot. So
yes, I think Cardinal Prevost, now Pope Leo XIV, said something to the effect of he tried to pick bishops. He tried to pick the bishops whom Pope Francis would want. So I guess from that, I think maybe the sense from the conclave was he wasn't the first pick, or maybe even the second or third pick, but he was. Everyone sort of came to when they couldn't agree on anything else because they need 2/3 of the vote. To go one way. 50%. I think it's simple majority.
Yeah, when they couldn't agree on maybe one of the more popular and or polarizing options, I think Pope Leo was one of the ones further down the list where everyone was like, "Oh yeah, we've met him. He's a nice guy. He seems to do a good job."
Yeah, if you want me to spin...
maybe isn't like the most stirring endorsement, but
I agree. For insiders, I think almost all insiders were surprised that the conclave ended this fast, because there was this perception that almost everybody high on the list who might be chosen as pope was, like you said, too polarizing. They stood too strong for something that wasn't mainstream enough to get a majority of the bishops. You have to consider all these guys rose to the top wherever they came from. Like these are not like your average voter person. These guys think well of themselves, or at least have a high regard for their own abilities. They're not going to be simple, "Oh, vote for me and I'll give you a cheeseburger." So it's not easy to get a majority of a group of very high functioning dudes in a group. And my quick spin on how this went down is, part of it was Prevost was not overly political or focused on one topic, but the other is his history is he was born in Chicago in 1955 and spent the first part of his life living there, and then he went to Villanova University in Philadelphia, which is run by the Augustinians, and just boom, right from there, that's your route into the religious order he joined, the Augustinians. Spent a while with them, got sent down to Peru. When he came back to the United States, he actually became head of, I believe, the Augustinians Midwest province, and then of the Augustinians worldwide, before going back to Peru, becoming a Peruvian bishop, becoming a Peruvian citizen. So the guy speaks perfect English, excellent Spanish. He also speaks Italian and I think 2 other languages.
German and French, I want to say.
Yeah, and then he spends all this time in Rome at head of one of the most important, they're called dicasteries, but sort of offices in the Vatican, very close to the Pope. So he had the North American vote because he's an American. He had the Spanish-speaking cardinals vote because he was a bishop in Peru.
Peru for 30 years.
Yeah, and been a close supporter of Pope Francis. And then he had a lot of the Italian cardinals' votes because he was their colleague. And then you just have to collect enough of the rest. You're almost at a majority of the College of Cardinals already, right there.
Yeah, and he, I mean, like you were saying, he throughout his whole career, if you want to call it whatever you call it, when they're, I guess it would be a career. Anyway, he seems to be very quiet. Like occasionally he will come out and say things, but he hasn't been polarizing. He hasn't been overly political. He doesn't tend to make a ton of comments, other than a few tweets. But really very, very mild stuff compared to some of the other cardinals who are constantly sort of getting into hot button stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think like you're saying, everyone kind of knew who he was, and he's not controversial. He's sort of a very safe guy to go with.
Do you have thoughts on his choice of papal name, Leo XIV?
I mean, I like Leo. Okay, I like Leo XIII. And actually, it's been sort of fascinating to see a lot of the spin that's been put on Leo XIII is like, oh, he was this very socialist, progressive pope. But he, I mean, in a way, yes, but not. Leo XIII, who presumably now Leo XIV has sort of tried to name himself after. Leo XIII was not socialist progressive in the modern sense, the way people are today. And I think, I don't know.
He's famous.
Think, again, Americans are looking at that and going, no, it's a progressive pope because Leo XIII was progressive. And it's like, well, no, Leo XIII is not modern.
He was progressive in the sense that he was moving from something to something else. So Leo XIII was pope from 1878 to 1903. He actually became the second longest reigning pope, I believe, after Peter himself, the first pope, the disciple of apostle of Jesus. One of my favorite facts about Leo XIII is when he was elected, he was 68, which in 1878, 68 is pretty old. And the consensus view was that he was elected as a caretaker pope to just be pope for a few years. And then the dude lived to 93 and outlived every single cardinal who voted for him.
which I mean, honestly, new Pope Leo's about the same age. He could do the same thing.
I think he's 1 year older. He's 69. And this was my first thought is Cardinal Prevost said, I want to live for a long time.
I'm going to be a 30-year pope.
I'm going to pick Leo. Self-interested.
Yeah.
But I think, so Leo XIII became pope just after Vatican I had occurred. The Industrial Revolution had kicked off in the 19th century, and in 1869, Pius IX started Vatican I. There was a lot of tumult going on in Christianity at the time, saying, hey, the world is changing dramatically. We need to figure out how to respond to this chaos. And Vatican I was the Catholic Church's first attempt to start doing that. And then it promptly got shut down before it really achieved anything by the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, and then the unification of Italy by Garibaldi. Yeah. And so Leo XIII came in, and he was the Pope who basically got to try to move the Catholic Church forward based on the need to sort of get with the needs of the modern Catholics in the world and the crazy stuff that was going on. And that's the kind of progressivism that it would be really fascinating to see if we can. Obviously, technological and social change in today's world is insane.
Yeah.
So
well, I don't know. I think that is something that maybe was on new Pope Leo's mind as well, because Leo XIII, like you're saying, it was the Industrial Revolution, and he wrote a letter,
Rerum
Novarum, which I actually really like, and
it means of new things in Latin.
It essentially in response to the Industrial Revolution and socialism, and it's basically about workers' rights. And this is where people are like, oh, he's a leftist, and now new Pope Leo is going to be a leftist. But it's not. If you actually read Rerum Novarum, it's not that. And yeah, so I'm curious if this Pope Leo sort of saw the Industrial Revolution and said, we are in a similar time of upheaval in terms of
Mm-hmm.
How people work and live and interact. And so I'm going to harken back to the last Leo and try and draw on some of that wisdom in my papacy.
I'll sketch an even bigger time frame. What I'll say is that the Catholic Church went through some weird times between Vatican I, which ended in 1870, and Vatican II, which started in 1961, so almost 100 years later. And Vatican II, the basic task was we need to actually do what we planned to do 91 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the tumult that has happened in the Catholic Church, especially in Western developed countries in the last 60 years, has been a result of the fact that Vatican II was trying to finish a job that should have been done in the 1800s. And it was trying to solve a problem out of the time that the problem needed to be solved in. And it came up with solutions in part that could never work because it was dealing with problems
viable.
that were problems that were out of their time. And I wonder if also Leo XIV, if he could be looking at his papacy as an attempt to try to
let's do Vatican III.
Or not even that, but to say we're coming out of a really tumultuous time where we had this attempt by the whole Catholic Church to do something necessary, and it ended up getting kind of messed up. And then a pope came along afterward and said, "Okay, we're going to move things forward anyway." And with Pope Leo, Pope Leo XIII, it was sort of centered around Rerum Novarum. If we could get something similar out of Leo XIV, I think that would be amazing.
Yeah.
So there's my thought on that. Let's jump back to Pope Francis briefly. You said that you were not a particular fan, or something along the lines of you think some of the things Pope Francis did were not maybe particularly helpful. Do you want to touch on some of those, the legacy he'll have?
So part of the problem that I think he didn't create this problem, but he maybe fanned the flames, either intentionally or unintentionally. But so there are sort of they're left wings and right wings in the church, in the church people, and Francis was more towards the left, and he tried, I think, to cater to some of their feelings and issues, which is legitimate. He's the Pope of all the Catholics. He has to do that. But I think part of the problem is that, similar to politics in the US, the left wing of the Catholic Church is never going to be satisfied by what the Pope is going to do. Like, as Francis could have gone even further left than he did, and I think they still would have been unhappy, because ultimately he was never going to make women priests, and he was never going to let gay people marry. Like, and no Pope is going to do that. Like, sorry for anyone
I think that's a great
who's looking forward to that. It's those things like that literally never going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that Pope Francis made lots of kind of liberal noises, but doctrinally, as far as teaching and doing stuff goes, he was very in great continuity with Benedict.
He didn't do any wild, crazy things. And so I think ultimately he sort of disappointed the left wing, because they were expecting all of this sort of magical whatnot to happen, and it was just never going to happen, no matter what he said or hinted or gave out in interviews. At the same time, he managed to sort of alienate the right wing, because he was very obviously more left, and he basically, I think, did nothing or very little to towards their sort of feelings and problems. So the right half felt just sort of abandoned, like he's not addressing any of our needs, and the left half felt like all he's doing is talk, and he's never actually gonna flip the switch and make women priests. And so I think he dissatisfied both sides of the church, and in the process sort of stoked resentment between the two sides. And again, how much of that was intentional, who knows? But I think the result was not a great one.
So I like the way you put that, and Pope Francis, please forgive me for making this comparison, because on Earth you would have probably rejected it strongly. He's a bit like Donald Trump, in that I think some of the things...
Polarizing.
Pardon?
He's polarizing.
Polarizing, but also the things that Donald Trump says that annoy the people who dislike him the most, is when he's being over the top. When he says extreme things that he's probably not going to do, or at least not going to be able to do.
Third term.
Right.
Realistically not going to happen, but it annoys people when he says that.
Yeah. And conversely, a lot of the people who are the most diehard Trump supporters, they're diehard not because of what he says, but because of how he says it. It's the rhetoric. It's the noise or the appearance that is the most polarizing aspect of Trump, I think, at least on the extremes. The funny thing about this comparison is people who like Donald Trump, you're acting the same as the people who like Pope Francis. You like the noise. And the people who dislike Donald Trump, you're acting like the people who dislike Pope Francis. You don't like the noise. So it's rhetoric in an inverted direction, I feel like, from Donald Trump.
Yeah, that is kind of a cool comparison, because it is two completely separate groups of people, but they're having similar reactions to.
Because I can say within the Catholic Church, the people who disliked Pope Francis the most were the most pro-Trump.
Sure.
And the people who disliked Pope Trump. There I am. He almost got me.
Slip.
The people who
Jacob accidentally says the quiet part out.
The people in the American Catholic Church who disliked Pope Trump, who disliked, we'll go with it, who disliked Trump the most, were the most likely to be pro Pope Francis.
Yes, they're on opposite sides of the American political spectrum, if you will.
Yeah. Going with this, then, I do want to ask, do you think there's a value in the kind of rhetoric that Pope Francis engaged in, the kind of noise he made, the kind of people he associated with, or gave interviews to, or expressed sympathy with? Is there a value to that?
I don't think there is. And this is one of the things that excites me about Leo, is that he seems to be a very quiet, reserved person, and I am really looking forward to that.
The Calvin Coolidge Pope.
Yes. I think maybe in past centuries it didn't matter as much, but in today's sort of media environment, I think stuff like that just really does more harm than good.
I mean, it garners clicks. It garners clicks from bots on social media.
Yeah, but I mean, what level of hell will those bots get you into?
Well put. One other thing about Pope Francis I wanted to bring up is the idea that he was actually, when it came to both his direct actions and some of the legal changes he made in the church, he was a fairly strong authoritarian. And one of the things I think that he deserves tremendous credit for is getting more of a hold of what was going on in the church's bureaucracy. I think that there have been massive financial scandals, among other things, in the Catholic Church recently. And I think those financial scandals have been happening for a long time. It's just nobody has known. And now people know. Pope Francis also gets credit for Pope John Paul II, who was acclaimed as a great pope and a saint in the Catholic Church, basically knew about Cardinal Theodore McCarrick in the United States and did nothing about him. And the same goes with Pope Benedict. Pope Francis could have continued that trend and let McCarrick get away with being an old cardinal with sitting on lots of money and philandering with young men, which Catholic priests and bishops and cardinals aren't supposed to.
Open secret among everyone in the U.S.
It was an open secret. And Pope Francis made a point of allowing Cardinal McCarrick, now not Cardinal McCarrick and now passed away, I believe, to actually be prosecuted and prosecuted like visibly, so everybody could see justice happening. I think he deserves great credit for that. But on some of his other things, like ordering a massive financial audit, he was very bad at follow through. Yeah. So there were a fair number of legal reforms and changes he made that were positive, and he just didn't seem to carry through.
Well,
so that's something I would look at.
I'm hopeful for Leo because he's another administrator. He's a canon lawyer, and so this is very much, and he's younger than Francis, and I think maybe 5 years younger than Francis was, so not dramatically younger, but I think he seems to be more active than Francis was at the start of his papacy, like just generally in better health, more capable. And so hopefully he's the type who has the mind and the training and the energy to go in and actually follow through with some of the stuff that Francis opened all of these sort of cans of worms that needed to be opened and cleaned up. And so hopefully Leo is the one who can come behind him in his nice 30-year tenure as Pope and actually finish cleaning up some of these scandals.
Yeah. One thing I think Pope Leo will have going for him, which I don't know how much this has been talked about yet, is the United States is the financial backing of the Roman Catholic Church. So, especially before Pope Francis, funds from the U.S. dried up a little bit under Pope Francis because he was so vocally anti-American. Yeah. But the U.S. donates so much money compared to the rest of the world. I think it's more than the rest of the world combined to the Holy See. Yeah. I think Pope Leo's ability to get stuff done based on the fact that he effectively is going to have the financial backing of the United States, the United States Catholics, is going to stand him tremendously well if he's trying to make substantial change.
Yeah, and I mean, that's, I think, going to be a huge advantage that he will have over, say, if we elected one of the Asian or the African cardinals. Who,
although that was an interesting prospect.
Yeah,
I was rooting for some dude whose name I couldn't pronounce.
Which, well, again, hilarious because I was reading a lot of threads about people really pushing for an African pope because they wanted a pope who was black, and it was just hilarious because I was like, you guys realize all of the African popes are the most conservative popes in the Catholic Church, like in like the nth degree. They are the most right-wing popes. So in pushing like to be diverse, you guys really don't quite know what you're doing.
Yes. In fact, an example of that is the German Bishops' Council got together and leveraged the Vatican to say, we don't want to just be able to give a blessing to gay couples, which you can give a blessing to anybody as a Catholic priest or bishop. They said, we want to specifically be able to bless their unions. We want to be able to use that language because the German bishops want to push the church toward recognizing gay unions as equivalent to marriage. And the Pope said, okay, you can bless their unions. The African bishops got together as a block and told the Vatican, we're not doing that. That's not going to happen in Africa.
They're awesome.
The answer they got was, okay, that's fine.
But which is like, if you know sort of.
So be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, if you know sort of the church politics, it's hilarious because the German and sort of Scandinavian bishops are constantly doing. I mean, since Martin Luther, they've been pushing crazy things, and the Africans have always been uber conservative, and yeah, it's funny to watch.
Yeah, discussion about geopolitical things and politics in the church is probably worth it at some point, but that's a little bit niche. So, do you have anything else on the topic of Leo versus Francis? Do we have a winner?
I mean, I have a lot of good feelings. My female intuition is
Ah,
I
okay.
think I really like Leo, and I think, like I said, I've seen him for all of 5 minutes, but he's already impressed me. So,
Nice
and
Chicago boy.
like I said at the beginning, he wears the little red cape, which look it just distinctively papal, right? It's what JP2 wore all the time. It's what Benedict wore, and Francis would walk around, and you could mistake him for a regular priest, um, which is sort of what he wanted, but
Yeah.
he wasn't sort of visibly the Pope.
All right.
I'm looking forward to when Leo breaks out the papal tiara.
Triple tiara. Yeah. All right. Well, I will say I think Francis did some really good things. I think, on the other hand, his papacy was a little bit schizophrenic. And yeah, I look forward to what the Lord gives to the Catholic Church under the new lion, Pope Leo. All right, jumping to the part where I try to share my screen without sounding like a dummy. All right, Veronica.
Speed that up in post. There'll be virtually no lag there.
And put in an overlay of somebody. Do you think we're going to get a decent option on the first try? We almost always go to the third try.
Yeah,
back ourselves into a corner.
We tried for something that's going to be like right up our alley. And I think it rarely worked.
Although, didn't we get something really remarkably...
Yeah, I think maybe the last time or the time before. Although, maybe not consecutive with this episode, but...
All right, I'm going to say I think we're actually going to get something related to Pope Leo. So here we go, first try.
Oh.
Veronica?
We should... I don't know if we should even talk about this. We should just...
Does fate exist? Or do you believe in free will?
This is I have good...
Our page...
Not Pope Leo, he's already possessed your computer.
Yeah, the page we got is Winchester Cathedral Choir. So this is an Anglican choir, but very ancient. Winchester Cathedral would have been associated with the Roman Church way back in the day. It's the largest cathedral of its kind in Northern Europe. I mean, absolutely massive, beautiful, old building. The cathedral as it stands today, construction started in the year 1079. We're coming up on 1,000 years old. Just unbelievable stuff. So, and the great English tradition of good church music. So, although I have to say, this image of a Winchester Cathedral chorister holding a box score is a little bit not quite nightmare-inducing, but not my favorite.
That is, for American listeners, which I imagine is all our listeners, it's a BACH score, not a box score.
What's a box score? Oh, box score. I mean, look, you can't get more Pope Leo appropriate. The guy came from a city with two famous baseball teams, Cubs and White Sox, and the photo on the wiki page we rolled, the guy's holding a box score.
It is all connected. His influence has already reached Wikipedia.
So Winchester Cathedral Choir, the wiki page is saying, was likely to have started in the 14th century, so the 1300s. This is when... So you have the whole fall of the Roman Empire, and civilization basically goes away for a long time. It's kind of... Books are copied by hand by monks in abbeys who can't even read the words in the books. They're just copying the shapes at some points. This is the early days as European society is reemerging from the Dark Ages. And, I mean, the early days of that are around the year 1000 when they're starting to build these tremendous things. But the 1300s is when they're actually starting to develop real music. They're starting to move out of simple Gregorian chant style stuff into the kind of thing you need choirs for, with people learning different lines and layered mixed harmonies. So this is the old days of sacred music. And there's actually a statute, it says in 1544, a statute of Henry VIII decreeing that the cathedral should have 10 boys in the choir and a single organist.
Yeah.
Works of John Tabb. Oh, this is newer stuff. That's not so great.
Yeah, they start out in the 1400s and then sort of skip the next 600 years.
Jump to the late 20th century. I guess for a lot of people reading this, it's going to be like parents or relatives or whatever of people in the choir. So they're going to be interested.
Choristers.
Wow, this is a relatively short article. I'm sure somebody must have written a great history of
for something that is famous and tours the world and releases CDs and has been around for 600 years. It's very brief.
Yeah. I do want to say the reason I found this, it may not be transparent to everybody who comes across this podcast. The reason I found this Wikipedia page uniquely appropriate to the new Pope is that, well, a variety of things, but there's a strong English Christian tradition very tied to Rome, even after the separation in the 1500s, separation that happened twice to develop the Anglican Church. There's this very strong identification between Anglican Christianity and Catholic Christianity. And the great English music and choral and sacred architecture tradition is just one of the real gems of the same Christianity that the Catholic Church belongs to. And then we have this link between English Christianity and the United States. It really formed what the United States is, and we now have this Pope from the United States. There has been one English Pope, I believe, in the past, but this will be the first.
Pope Adrian, I want to say.
Adrian the Fourth, I want to say, but
sure, let's go with that.
But this will be the first native English-speaking Pope in about 700 years, I believe. So.
Well, in the last one, I don't think spoke recognizable English.
Perhaps not.
I mean, recognizable for his day, but I mean, one of the things we were talking about before is that it's weird to see Pope Leo in interviews because he has a normal American accent, and it's very disconcerting to see your Pope not have a foreign accent.
Which is going to be an interesting experience for us because I really count myself as a John Paul II kid. I mean, John Paul II became Pope in 1978 and died in 2005. It was 3 or 5.
Yeah. So
I was an adult, effectively, by the time he died.
Well, Benedict XVI, I think he died in November.
No, you can't split my numbers.
It wasn't 3. Because I see what I'm in my head. I'm going back to which house we lived in when Benedict was elected, because I remember watching him get elected. And
he died April 2nd, 2005.
Okay.
So I was basing it on, did John Paul II die the year the last Star Wars prequel film came out, or the last year a Lord of the Rings movie came out?
See, this is the male mind versus the female mind.
So here's a last bit of Francis.
Yeah, mm-hmm. I think what you were saying, JP2 is sort of the foundational pope for a huge number of Catholics. So that's like the default. When you think pope in your mind, the default image is JP2, because that's what so many of us had for years and years. Yeah,
I would say if you were born before a certain point, obviously younger people are going to have a different experience. I do want to say something that struck me about Pope Francis's death that I thought was somewhat interesting is I have only been alive for 2 popes to die in office. Pope Benedict had retired, so I was alive for John Paul II's death, and I was alive for Pope Francis's death. Pope John Paul II, again, you can call this accidental if you want, but one of his big focuses was the Feast of Divine Mercy, which was based on a Polish nun's writings and requests. And he established the Feast of Divine Mercy on the 8th day of Easter. So Catholics celebrate Easter across 8 days. John Paul II died on the Feast of Divine Mercy, so on the Sunday after Easter. So technically within the Easter holiday itself. Pope Francis also died during Easter, and I think that's again, I don't think that's an accident.
Well,
that Pope Francis died during Easter week.
If you want to be sort of very
okay, make it a downer, Veronica.
Not a downer, but sort of more very sort of realistic about it. Lent is, all Catholics are supposed to sort of fast and abstain and whatnot. So it's sort of our like most grueling time of the year. Sorry, I don't know why I put like grueling in air quotes, but whatever. It's the hardest time to be Catholic, that Lent time. But in particular, the week leading up to Easter for priests, they have like the most stuff to do in terms of liturgies to get through and various stuff they, like basically like hours they have to be in church doing stuff. And so if you're an old pope, it is a very grueling schedule to get through that last week before Easter. So simply from like a medical perspective, it's not surprising that popes like give up the ghost during like sometime shortly after Easter because they're worn out.
So 2 quick counterpoints. One is both Francis and John Paul were very ill coming into Lent, and or definitely on the downturn. And the other is, going by your logic, we should see all the popes dying in December and January when everybody's getting the flu.
Yeah, because Christmas would be the other big. Yeah.
Well, but also that's when the elderly are most likely to die of the seasonal flu or some other respiratory.
That's true, especially if you're in an old drafty castle. I think someone needs to go back through all of the popes and make some sort of chart of when they died, and we will see which one of us is correct.
Especially Pope Joan. She was probably an outlier.
Well, I don't know what we're going to do about the popes who weren't in Italy, because if you're in a different environment, that's putting all sorts of different things into your equation.
That's right. Yeah, and non-ethnic European popes, and yeah, it's going to be a lot of work. All right. Anything else on the popes or Winchester Cathedral Choir, Veronica?
No. I think we've covered everything. We've killed the popes. No, but now, we have another, like you're saying, we have another 30 years of Pope Leo to talk about. So this will be an evergreen topic.
To a long and glorious reign.
Amen.